What's going on, guys? Tower number 9 here, and today we're going to go into a leader overview, this time of the Villainy leaders. So this is sort of part two. I had a part one that went over the heroism leaders of Spark of Rebellion that I posted yesterday. And I was originally going to post this later in the week, but I actually found that it was much faster to make the presentation and stuff for it the second time around. So yeah, we're going to get into it here with the villainy leaders from Spark of Rebellion. So first off, I'll show Darth Vader, Dark Lord of the Sith. So Vader is an aggression villainy leader. He actually is not in the set normally, so you won't find Darth Vader in the booster packs for this set, but he is in the two-player starter product and was also available as a promo card in the pre-releases and at certain events. So he is an aggression villainy leader who deploys at 7 resources. As an action, he can spend 1 resource and exhaust. So if you played a villainy card this phase, you can deal 1 damage to a unit and 1 damage to a base. And when he deploys, he is a 5/8 that deploys at 7 or more resources, and on attack, he may deal 2 damage to a unit. So Vader is a interesting leader. He's really strong when he deploys. He's one of the strongest leaders when he deploys. But because that's 7 resources, that's going to arrive substantially after most leaders in the game. So there are a lot of leaders that are going to be arriving on 5 or 6 resources, and Sabine arrives at 4 resources. So while Vader is strong, you often accumulate some disadvantage in the period before you get a chance to deploy him, which can create an interesting dynamic. That's not to say that he doesn't do anything before deploying. His leader side can deal ping damage, which can be relevant for removing shields, and it can also be very strong against certain units that only have 1 HP. So, for instance, if your opponent plays a Death Star Stormtrooper, 1 cost 3/1, Vader can deal with that without having to use a card of his own in a lot of situations. So, Vader's Vader's kind of expensive or late deployment makes him go well with ramp cards. So we see a lot of people playing Vader Command and running Resupply and Super Laser Technician in order to just allow Vader to deploy faster. And that's been a very efficient synergy with him, but it does leave him a bit vulnerable to more aggro builds. So Vader is probably not the leader you want to pick if your local meta is full of Sabine players and so on, but in terms of a ramp and kind of late game type leader, I actually think he can be very strong. Um, his leader ability does rely on having villainy cards in the build. He's kind of a parallel to Luke Skywalker Faithful Friend, whose leader ability relies on having heroism cards in the build. And Vader also has both the Force and Imperial traits, which enable some synergies, as well as the Sith trait, which doesn't do anything right now. Overall, I think he's a quite strong leader if you prefer kind of a more late game playstyle, playing some more expensive stuff and maybe ramping up to get there faster. Let's take a look at his actual unit side there. And we're also showing the variants of the cards. So on the left, we have the standard version of Vader, 7 cost, 5/8 on attack. You may deal 2 damage to a unit. In the middle, we have the version that you can find in the pre-release kits. As you can see, it's kind of an alt art version there. Same sort of scene, but depicted differently with more dramatic lightsaber glow and reflections. And then on the right, we have the hyperspace version, and that's the one that was available at Gen Con and some other events. So that's Darth Vader for you. And again, not available in the set normally, but was available in the pre-release kits. And if you're looking to pick this leader up now, there's a good chance you could find him as a single card, but you could also just pick up the 2-player starter. All right, we're going to move on from Vader. Next up, we have Director Krennic aspiring to authority. Krennic is a vigilance villainy leader. He's an interesting character. So he has a passive ability that gives each friendly damaged unit +1 power, and he deploys at 5 resources as a 2/7, and then has that same passive, but also has Restore 2. Um, so he's kind of a control leader but it's a little interesting because unlike some leaders that tend to go for more of a control playstyle, he isn't all that strong himself in his personal stats, and he deploys rather early, which is kind of an interesting. It's kind of an interesting place to be. However, he has some really good synergies with certain cards. So Death Trooper, for instance, is absolutely excellent with him because the Death Trooper frequently damages itself when played, and so Krennic turns that downside into a partial upside because by damaging itself when being played, the Death Trooper now also buffs itself. Um, Krennic does have the Imperial and official traits that allows him to synergize with certain Imperial cards, and it does also mean that he can run Emperor's Royal Guard more efficiently, which I think is a very solid card for him. Um, it's a little odd where he's at though because he isn't very aggressive, so he only has 2 attack. But at the same time he isn't like a huge late game powerhouse either. So I tend to think that he works well on more of a control or of a mid-rangey sort of build, but you definitely need to incorporate more late game cards to do well against other controller late game decks because Krennic on his own isn't going to be a powerhouse leader like you might see with Vader or Palpatine, who we'll show later. On the other hand, that passive can add up to a lot of value over the course of the game. The Restore 2 that you get on Krennic's unit side represents a lot of potential healing if the opponent doesn't deal with him, and overall I think he's an interesting pick. So here we have the different variations of Krennic, and as usual, we have standard version on the left, showcase in the middle, and hyperspace on the right side. Next up, we have Iden Versio, my personal favorite of the Vigilance Villainy leaders. So, Iden Versio, Inferno Squad Commander. Her ability is Action Exhaust. If an enemy unit was defeated this phase, heal 1 damage from your base. And so she also tends to be kind of a control leader, but she has, even more healing than Krennic does, which is kind of an interesting dynamic, which can really help to stave off some of the more aggro decks. She's also a little better at fighting herself. On the other hand, she doesn't have Krennic's passive, and she does deploy 1 resource later, deploying on 6 resources instead of 5. So her leader side is only 4/4, which seems really bad for a leader that deploys at 6 resources, but she does actually come with a shield token when you deploy her, which can make her very difficult to deal with in some cases. Uh, She's the only leader with the Trooper trait in the game at present, which matters for certain synergy cards. So I believe General Tag and Precision Fire are Trooper synergy cards right now, as well as the Volunteer Soldier, who is unlikely to see play in constructed decks, but is something to consider. And even more so than Krennic, I think Iden potentially represents a lot of bonus base HP via her healing, which can be really nice to allow you to fight against aggro. And then the Villainy Vigilance card pool has some good control tools, some removal, and so on that allows you to play a late game. I personally prefer Iden to Krennic, and I am not necessarily the only one who thinks that. I think Iden has been pretty popular recently, especially Iden Green, though I personally prefer Iden Red. Let's take a look at Iden's unit card. So, as I mentioned earlier, 4/4 with Shielded. When an enemy unit is defeated, heal 1 damage from your base as a passive ability, potentially representing a lot of healing if a bunch of different units are defeated in a turn. Now, one thing I will say about Iden is that 4/4 shielded is better, I think, than being 4/7 in many cases, but there are some cases where it's bad. So one situation where it might be weaker is if your opponent has a lot of cheap low attack units, so can easily send something in to remove the shield. Another situation would be if the opponent has access to Saboteur and can potentially defeat her shield directly while attacking. An especially funny scenario is if you have Iden and your opponent has Cassian, who is a 4/6 with Saboteur and deploys at the same time. If the opponent brings Cassian out before you bring out Iden, you might have to do some sort of trickery or get him exhausted or try to defeat him before deploying Iden yourself, as you are potentially going to be taken out in one attack. That being said, I overall quite like Iden, probably one of my favorite leaders in the game at present. Okay, let's move on. Next, we have Emperor Palpatine, Galactic Ruler. So he is a command villainy leader. He is probably the most powerful leader in the game on his unit side, but he deploys the latest of any leader at 8 or more resources. And we were talking earlier about how Vader likes to run ramp to try to get get the deployment timing faster on a leader that otherwise can sometimes deploy a little late. And Palpatine is like that, but even more so. So Palpatine almost needs to run ramp in order to hit the field in time. It's very easy for him to be defeated, for not for him the leader to be defeated, but for you to lose the game if you're playing Palpatine before he ever deploys, which is kind of a problem. Um, but if you can get him onto the field, he is extremely impactful. So on his leader side, he has an action where for one resource you can exhaust and defeat a friendly unit to deal 1 damage to a unit and draw a card. On his unit side, he has a similar version as an on attack trigger. You can defeat a friendly unit to deal 1 damage to a unit and draw a card on attack. And then additionally, when you deploy him, you can take control of a damaged enemy unit. And that's basically permanent. So that's extremely strong. But you can only do that if you control 8 or more resources. And this makes him really, really excellent in control mirrors, where the other person is also playing kind of a slow long-term deck, because you can easily use his ability to take control of a fairly strong unit and deploy a really powerful leader at the same time and really gain the advantage in the late game. But he is extremely vulnerable to aggro. Earlier I was discussing how Vader is vulnerable to aggro because he deploys so late, and Palpatine is like that, but even more so. One interesting factor about Emperor's Royal Guard unit, even when not deployed, turning that unit from a 3/4 to a 3/5. Nice little trick there, and pretty relevant. He also tends to synergize with some of the smaller units, especially ones that have some kind of ability when defeated. So like Vanguard Infantry, which is a 1 cost unit, and when defeated it can give an experience to another unit. Palpatine can play that and can defeat the unit basically at will with his ability in order to damage an opponent and draw a card. Similarly, if he plays a Super Laser Technician, even if the opponent doesn't have units force, deal damage to an opponent and draw a card, which is a lot of value you're potentially getting in one move. So that's Emperor Palpatine Galactic Ruler. And yeah, there is his unit side. He has maybe one of the coolest showcase arts there in the middle. And the hyperspace one on the right side is also honestly very cool. Yeah, 8 cost 4/10. When deployed, take control of a damaged non-leader unit, and on attack, you may defeat another friendly unit if you do deal 1 damage to a unit and draw a card. Really interesting leader. Right now, because he is so slow, I'm not sure that he has had the greatest early results, but it's very possible that he will be doing well in the future. Someone will figure out a deck that can, maybe hold out for long enough to reliably deploy him, at which point you can potentially gain a huge advantage. Okay, so that's Palpatine. Next up, we have Grand Moff Tarkin, Oversector Governor. So Tarkin is a command villainy leader who can buff other Imperial units on both his leader and unit side. So as a leader, he can spend 1 resource and exhaust to give an experience token to an Imperial unit. And as a unit, he gives an experience token to another Imperial unit on attack. So he's an interesting case because even though he is a command leader, he's less synergistic with ramp than some of the other leaders that the Empire has to offer, because he is a relatively early deployment. And in this game, ramp cards are much better when they're accelerating your leader deployment than they are afterwards. So, let's say you have a deck with a bunch of ramp cards and you ramp on turn 2, and then you can deploy Tarkin on turn 3. If you draw other ramp cards, playing them, it does accelerate you towards endgame units, but it doesn't accelerate you towards a leader deployment, which makes it much worse than if you are playing, say, Vader, where drawing multiple ramp cards can actually be really good because they are bringing Vader out faster. So that's an interesting factor to consider. Tarkin Tarkin does have kind of non-aggressive stats also. He's a 2/7, which puts him in a kind of odd place because you might think that you could run sort of an aggro deck with Tarkin, but it might be difficult to do that given that the leader himself is not all that aggressive. And he is a little reliant on having other units to buff when you compare that to other aggro leaders like, I don't know, if you look at like Sabine, for instance, Sabine can be very aggressive just on her own, doesn't really require specific trait synergies or similar. One thing that Tarkin does really well, though, is he pairs well with 1 cost units on the first turn. So if you play, for instance, ISB Agent or the TIE LN, Tarkin can then give that unit an experience with your other resource. So ISB agent could not only damage an opponent when played, but it could then become a 2/4, which is really strong. Tai LN could be a 3/2 in space, which is again really strong. Very nice little synergy there. And in general, this ability can help get value if you end up playing below the curve, kind of similar to Luke's shield or Vader's ping. Overall, I quite like Tarkin. Like conceptually, I haven't quite found a deck where I think he really sings. Um, it'd be interesting to think about. It'd be interesting to think of him maybe as sort of a more aggro or mid-rangey leader. I do think that if you go for kind of the long game ramp and game control type stuff, there are probably other villainy leaders that do that plan better. So he has to kind of carve out a different niche for himself, and I'm not sure that I at least have quite found it yet. But I think he's very cool. So then again, there is his unit side. 5 cost, 2/7 Imperial Official. On attack, you may give an experience token to another Imperial unit. And it is worth noting that it is another Imperial unit, so he cannot buff himself. However, like Krennic, he does have the official trait, which means that he can be an enabler for the Emperor's Royal Guard, giving it Sentinel. Okay. Oh, and this part erroneously says Leia Organa Alliance General up here, but he is in fact Grand Moff Tarkin Oversighter Governor. My apologies for the oversight. I was using the previous heroism version as a template, and I forgot to copy and paste that time. A little bit of an error. Sorry about that. All right, next up we have Grand Inquisitor hunting the Jedi. This is a really weird and unique leader, and I think he's very cool. So Grand Inquisitor is an aggression villainy leader. As an action, he can exhaust and deal 2 damage to a friendly unit with 3 or less power to ready it. So he basically is damaging his own units to ready them for extra attacks, whether that be the ability to attack on the same turn that you deployed a unit, or whether it's a unit that's already attacked and you're going to ready it and attack again, you can potentially get a lot of value there. And the main downside of this, aside from the fact that it damages your own guys, is that it is costly in terms of tempo, and he is very vulnerable to Tarkin Town also at the base that can take an epic action to deal damage to an enemy damaged unit. Um, so there are some situations that can be a little unsafe for him, which is worth noting, but he still has some interesting stuff to offer. He's probably the best villainy leader for using force synergy because he deploys earlier than the other villainy force leaders, which would be Darth Vader and Emperor Palpatine. And additionally, the other villainy force units are pretty synergistic with Grand Inquisitor and not that synergistic with the other leaders. So most Vader decks, for instance, are probably not going to be playing Seventh Sister, and Fifth Brother works a lot better for Grand Inquisitor than for Vader. And as a result, not only is Grand Inquisitor the quickest deploying villainy force leader at this time, but he also is a deck that is probably more likely to want to play the other villainy force units, which makes him a good candidate if you're trying to make a deck that uses force throw, it binds all things, those sorts of force synergy cards in villainy, then Grand Inquisitor might be your pick, similar to how Chirrut might be the best option for that in heroism. Grand Inquisitor does have very bad stats for his deployment timing, so he's a 3/6 at that deploys at 6 resources. This is like really actually very bad. So, there are 4/7 leaders at 6 resources. Honestly, 3/6 would be a not inspiring stat line at 5. But in exchange, his ability it can be really, really impactful. I do think that the best way to run this leader might be more of a combo approach where you're really thinking about how to get the maximum value out of that ability and relying on that as an important part of your build. I could be wrong. This leader also wasn't really, at least in the pre-releases that I saw, this guy was not played very much. I think he's kind of overshadowed in that pre-release sealed format by Vader, who is more straightforward and less combo-y, and also just more powerful as an individual leader card. But it's worth noting that with Vader not available in sealed outside of the pre-releases, and with Vader also not being available in draft, Grand Inquisitor might have more of a time to shine there, though he is a rare and is going to be less accessible. Um, Let's take a look at his unit side. Very cool art, by the way, on that showcase version in the middle there. I think it looks really cool. So Grand Inquisitor hunting the Jedi, 6 cost 3/6 on attack. You may deal 1 damage to another friendly unit with 3 or less power and ready it. So I think he does represent kind of an interesting combo-y archetype, and I'm going to be very curious to see what people can put together with him and whether there's a sweet combo deck already available in this first set. Don't know for sure, but at least in theory, he can set up some kind of crazy things with cards like Fifth Brother, Keep Fighting, and potentially some other stuff. Okay, so that's going to do it for Grand Inquisitor. Let's move on to IG-88 Ruthless Bounty Hunter. So IG-88 is an aggression villainy leader. He is an aggro-oriented leader in villainy, which is unusual. Usually villainy is more control and heroism is more aggro, but IG-88 is a quite aggressive sort of leader. He benefits from outnumbering opponents on his leader side. He allows you to attack with a unit, and if you control more units than the defending player, then the attacker gets buffed. Nice little ability there. On his unit side, he has strong offense but weak defense. He's actually a 5/4. Um, and this allows him to hit very hard, but at the same time he can be taken out relatively easily by multiple, like even 3 cost units, cards like Open Fire. He's very vulnerable when he does deploy, and unfortunately that vulnerability has kind of meant that he might actually be the worst leader in the game in early play. Now obviously it's still early, we don't really know for sure, but he is very vulnerable, and a lot of the time he deploys and is very quickly defeated, and he just doesn't really seem to have the same aggressive impact as you might see with a card like Sabine Wren. Additionally, the card pool for Villainy isn't quite as supportive of aggro as the one is for heroism, so he's just really in kind of an odd place right now. It's very possible that, future synergies with Underworld or Bounty Hunter, even droid synergies will help, or maybe someone will come up with an innovative build that allows you to really use IG-88 like effectively. At least for now, though, especially for new players, I wouldn't recommend like focusing a ton on this leader simply because I think he has had a lot of difficulty early on, and he may be harder to make work than some of the others. Of course, if you're the bold player who wants to be the one who figures IG-88 out and cracks the code and makes him a really competitive deck, then by all means go for it. But I just think as a potential warning, it might not be the one I would recommend starting with. Um, so here we see his unit side, 5 cost, 5/4, and when he's deployed as a unit, he gives each other friendly unit raid 1 unconditionally, whereas on his leader side, he does have that attack with a unit and giving a bonus power only if you control more units than the defending player. So interesting card. I have to say also, when I first saw this card, I thought he was going to be so good, and I was unfortunately disabused of that notion as I flailed around trying to make him work, but maybe somebody else will succeed where I failed. One other note about IG-88 is I think his art is really cool. I think his showcase looks great. I think his normal art looks great. He's like kind of stalking through a cyberpunk city with like the neon signs and stuff. It looks really cool. So, you know, hopefully someone will figure out how to turn the cool looks and concept here into a winning character as well. Okay, so that's going to do it for IG-88. Next up, we have Boba Fett collecting the bounty. And if IG-88 was one of the worst leaders in early play, Boba Fett collecting the bounty has looked to be one of the best leaders. So he is a cunning villainy leader. He tends to be either a kind of mid-range or a more aggro or tempo-oriented leader, depending on what base you go with. I think that a command Boba Fett is more of a mid-range build, and then the double cunning Boba is more aggro or tempo-y, as is the aggression Boba. And there hasn't been a lot of play with vigilance Boba that I'm aware of, but maybe there's a cool deck there as well. So he has the best, most efficient. So he has the best leader stats for his timing of anyone in the game. So he deploys at 5 resources and he's a 4/7. It's worth noting that other leaders that get 4/7 stats deploy at 6 resources. So he's basically just one of the most efficient guys in terms of pure stats. Um, His ability allows you to reuse resources, which can be really good, but it can be a little timing sensitive. The way that this works is when an enemy unit leaves play, you may exhaust him on his leader side to ready a resource, and on his unit side, it's an effect that goes off after he resolves an attack, and then if an enemy unit has left play, you can actually get two resources. Now, I will say that there is one thing about this that I think is frequently misunderstood and makes Boba not as strong as he first appears, and that is when an enemy unit leaves play does not apply to a leader unit being defeated, because a leader unit that is defeated does not leave play. It just goes back to being a leader instead of a leader unit. And as a result of that, if the only enemy unit that's been defeated in the turn is a leader unit, this ability does not allow you to ready a resource. So that is something that I've seen players get wrong before, and it's worth noting. It does make him a bit weaker. Um, but he's still very strong. This is his unit side, so 5 cost, 4/7. When this unit completes an attack, if an enemy unit left play this phase, ready up to 2 resources. One other note is that because it is a when this unit completes an attack trigger, that does mean that it does not go off if he is defeated in the attack. So if he trades with an opposing unit, he does not get that trigger. Um, Overall, though, very strong card, very cool art. Honestly, I like the normal art even more than the showcase version, but I know a lot of people really like the showcase version of this card. I think the showcase Boba might actually be the most valuable card in the set at present on the secondary market, though I don't know for sure. And overall, I think Boba is a definitely one of the stronger leaders in the earlier set, at least in the early play that we've been seeing. And it'll be interesting to see if that keeps up or if people will figure out some counters or what exactly will happen. But overall, Boba Fett collecting the bounty, very strong character. Okay. One other note is that there is a card called Fett's Fire Spray, which is a 6 cost 5/6 space unit that has an ability that can exhaust non unique units for a cost. But perhaps more relevantly, if you control Boba Fett or Jango Fett as your leader or as a unit, it comes into play ready. And that can be a great closer for Boba because playing a 5 cost chip that comes into play ready allows you to push damage through aggressively in the end game. Um, and it can be very difficult for opponents to deal with. Now, there are some things that can deal with it. You know, if the opponent has a simple vanquish, they can take out the Fett's Fire Spray and do so for less than it costs the Boba player to play the Fire Spray. There are also, other big space units and things that can fight against it. But it's a very, very strong card in a Boba deck. Actually, in one of my pre-releases, I had Boba as one of my leaders, and I had a Fett's Fire Spray in my pool. And I think that was I think that was one of the ones where I went undefeated, at least in matches. I don't know about games, but I think I might have gone undefeated in games too, because that might have been one of the best of one ones. But yeah, very, very strong synergy. Overall, a very strong leader, really efficient stats. Ability can be very good, but it is a little timing sensitive. So, for instance, if you attack and defeat an opposing unit as the first action of the turn and you haven't spent any resources yet, well, you kind of missed your chance to get the resources off that attack. So, kind of an interesting thing, but overall, I think one of the strongest leaders in the game. All right, next up we have Grand Admiral Thrawn, patient and insightful. He is a cunning villainy leader, and his ability is really interesting. So when the action phase starts, you look at the top card of each player's deck, and this is so useful because it can provide information on upcoming cards for both players. So not only do you know what you're going to draw and can plan your turn accordingly, you know what your opponent is going to draw, and you can like start formulating your counters before the opponent has even played the relevant cards. So this is really good, and it really fits into Grand Admiral Thrawn's character and concept as someone who's always thinking ahead and has these strategies developed to counter his opponents. And yeah, overall, he also has an interesting ability to exhaust. So, for one resource, you can exhaust him to reveal the top card of any player's deck and exhaust a unit that costs the same as or less than the revealed card. And because of his other ability, you might know what that card is in advance. So even though the ability looks like it might not be reliable, you might actually, in fact, know what that card is. Though there are some situations where you might no longer know. So, for instance, if you have looked at the top card of each player's deck. And since then, both players have drawn a card through one effect or another. All of a sudden, you don't have that information anymore, and his exhaust might no longer be reliable. So that's kind of an interesting scenario. That being said, he works very well against cheap units that someone might buff. So, for instance, if someone is playing, let's say they play a Green Squadron A-Wing and then buff it with a Wing Leader, which is a common aggro play and very annoying, it's very likely, even if you don't know for sure what those top cards are going to be, that the top card of one deck or the other is going to be a 2 cost or less. Because you can exhaust a unit that costs the same as or less, so that is going to provide you a pretty reliable exhaust, though there is a risk of a 1 or 0 cost if you don't know, but most of the time you know. Additionally, the fact that you get to see that top card works well with abilities that are top deck based. So one example would be Greedo. So when Greedo is defeated, you may choose to discard the top card of your deck, and if you do that discard and hit a non-unit card, you can deal 2 damage to a ground unit. So with Thrawn, you can know for sure whether or not Greedo is going to work and plan accordingly. Maybe you see that non-unit on top of your deck, and you're like, okay, I know that I can attack into Greedo, hit this top deck, and potentially take out 2 units at once. So very relevant there. Um, so Thrawn seems to be kind of a disruption or control-oriented leader currently. He isn't the most aggressive, but his ability can kind of stall the opponent, exhaust their stuff, and move you closer toward the late game, where you also have more value of information, knowing some of the stuff that each player is going to draw. When he deploys, he has 3/9 deploying on 6 resources, making him quite difficult to remove. And he has basically the same exhaust ability, but as an on attack for free instead of as an action for 1. One thing I will say is that Thrawn has maybe been overshadowed a bit by Boba. So Boba is really straightforwardly strong and cunning villainy, and I think people have gravitated more in early play towards Boba than they have towards Thrawn because Boba is a lot easier to make work. Now, I think Thrawn can also be good. In my opinion, he has quite a lot of potential, but he is more complex than Boba and doesn't have as much like raw power. So I think that a lot of people have gravitated towards the simple and effective Boba rather than the more complex Thrawn. However, I do not think that he is an overall weak card. Looking at the different variations here, we again have the standard version on the left, showcase in the middle, and hyperspace on the right. And as viewers of Star Wars Rebels may know, the showcase version is a much more cartoon version, and it is a lot like his appearance in the Star Wars Rebels show, which makes an interesting contrast to the standard version where they went for a more realistic style. So, for Han, they have the more stylized, cartoony version as the standard, and the more realistic one as the showcase. And for Thrawn, they went the other way around. You can also see kind of a wanted poster, something of Ezra Bridger up there in the background of Thrawn showcase art, which is another nice little touch for fans of the Rebels show. Okay, and then this, on the ground unit side, Thrawn is a 6 cost 3/9. When the action phase starts, look at the top card of each player's deck, and on attack, you may reveal the top card of any player's deck and exhaust a unit that costs the same as or less than Thrawn for you. Okay, then those were the villainy leaders from the Spark of Rebellion set. So some final thoughts here. I mentioned this earlier in the discussion of the heroism leaders, but villainy tends to favor more control or endgame types of builds as an overall card pool and with the abilities that its leaders have. And this is sort of thematically fitting with the Empire's role in this part of the Star Wars saga. So, we're thinking about kind of the Galactic Civil War original trilogy era where the Empire is trying to solidify its control and the rebels are kind of trying to attack and disrupt them before they can do that. So, fittingly for that theme, the rebels tend to be more aggro sorts of decks, and the Empire tends to be more control oriented sorts of decks. But there are of course still some solid options for mid range. There's maybe the best mid range leader right now, which is Boba Fett. And if you want to play an aggro deck, there are some options for that too. The Boba Cunning, for instance, is a fairly aggressive deck. Unfortunately, the most dedicated aggro leader of the villainy group, IG-88, has looked to be a bit weak in early play, actually quite a bit weak, but perhaps there's something to be discovered there that will make him a more powerful contender. Um, One interesting note about the villainy leaders is that for the heroism leaders, rebel trait synergy is really good, and cards like Wing Leader, Fleet Lieutenant are very strong cards, as well as things like Rebel Assault. And you see a lot of decks playing these cards. For the Empire, the Imperial trait synergy just isn't quite as good. So the equivalents to the Wing Leader and Fleet Lieutenant would be the TIE Advanced and the Snowtrooper Lieutenant, and they're both a little bit worse just based on their stats and timing compared to their rebel counterparts. Is kind of a downside in that it means that like Imperial trait synergy decks aren't necessarily as good, but it can also be in some ways an upside because it means that villainy decks are a little less reliant on trait synergy and you have more flexibility to bring in cards that are not Imperials. So for instance, Boba Fett is not an Imperial, and that is something of a downside, but it's less of a downside than a heroism leader not being rebel is. So little interesting element there. Of these leaders, my personal favorites would probably be Iden, Boba, and Tarkin. I actually quite like Tarkin. I haven't quite figured out how to make him work, but I really like him just conceptually. And overall, once again, there are a lot of different options for different ways to play the game represented in these leaders. It's really something to me. It's very surprising that they managed to get 18 leaders into this first set with 16 in the boosters and then Luke and Vader in that starter in those starter products with the pre-release kits and the two-player starter. When I was first looking at preview stuff for this game, I thought there would be like maybe like 4 to 8 leaders or something, and they more than doubled that. So that's been really impressive to me, and there really is a lot of variety in deck building in this game. Even now, in the first set, Spark of Rebellion, I think that there are a lot of different options for how to play with the leaders and bases in different aspects, and I suspect that will grow even further as the card pool expands with future sets. Okay, so that's going to do it for this one, guys. Thanks to you all for watching. If you disagree with me on some of these leaders or how best to run them, feel free to let me know in the comments below. I do read all the comments, though I do not always reply to everything, but I try to reply and engage over there. And yeah, if there are other overviews or other sorts of cards you'd be interested in seeing, feel free to let me know as well. And finally, feel free to let me know what you think of these sort of more produced style of videos. I've done a lot of just sort of talking head type videos or kind of easier to make content, and these are a little more involved, though I think I'm getting the hang of it and can set them up faster than I did for the first one at least. And they're a little more involved, but I think it's an interesting and potentially helpful format. So let me know what you think about that, or if you'd rather see more YouTube shorts, just quick takes, more talking head type stuff, anything like that. Just feel free to let me know in the comments below, or send me a message on Discord at Tower Number 9, all spelled out. Anyway, that's gonna about do it for this one, guys. Thanks to y'all for watching, and we'll be back later with some more Star Wars Unlimited content. I will catch you guys later.